I'm based in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Ah, okay. I'm in Oakland, California. So yeah, I reached out to you because we have some shared interests. Although you've done a much deeper dive, to use that phrase, on the topics of econ and political philosophy than I have, especially econ. Um, and I know you're a contributor to Palladium, if I pronounce it, not Pelagium, but Palladium.
I think it's Palladium, but don't
Palladium.
quote me on that. I've heard it both ways.
Okay. Where would you say, to start kind of high level here, where would you say that you're coming from as far as your views on economics? Is it mainly left, mainly right, or would you describe it as somehow beyond either?
Well, let me put it this way. So I came to economics. It was not my intention going to college. I was a government major at William Mary. I took some econ classes because I wanted to understand like how that because I knew in like politics and political theory you are constrained by what you can do by what is materially possible, and that deals with like the realm of economics.
Right.
Um, I was very dissatisfied with what I got in econ. I took the beginning and then the intermediate classes. Calculus killed me, but I didn't really learn anything from those classes. Uh, what I what I ended up digging into is the tradition of classical political economy and the people who've carried it forward to this day, who have been mostly been Marxian economists, um, and I did this because I felt that as I learned the history of economic thought, that the uh, the marginal revolution, which was kind of put into place by Alfred Marshall about the 1890s going forward, really put econ back as a science. That it was no longer well. You can say that it is rigorous in a certain level on its own terms, but my argument is that it is not trying to answer any of the same questions that classical political economy was, and that it's become so abstracted from the problems of both policy and base and production that uh, it's not really in economic science. It's basically just trying to apply math to a very specific problem.
Okay, so you say that economics has become so abstracted from the traditional concerns of political economy, emphasis on the political as far as what the ends of any sort of resource allocation should be. It's somehow just like math running away with itself, and it's only concerned with its internal references, regardless of certain societal ends or of a normative type. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yes and no. I think that it doesn't just apply to the normative side. 'Cause I think that marginalism, especially whenever Pareto kind of enters the conversation, it has very strong normative claims about about resource allocation. This is more along the lines of economic development on the one hand, and ways of coordinating production on the other, which deals with which is basically encompassed today in the theory of the firm, but which has a much richer tradition in classical political economy and how it's been brought forward with input-output analysis, with econophysics and um, institutional economics, which is the one influence I draw on that's not particularly left. But I
It's
have a critique of it from the left.
institutional economics. Yeah.
Yes.
And
I mean, I'm mostly thinking of Atkinson and Mowgli and their book Why Nations Fail.
okay, so that's an example of institutional economics.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned Alfred Marshall. Um, it was my understanding, and this is probably the kind of Austrian econ bias that I was fed when I was involved more in libertarianism, but I thought someone like Karl Menger or Eugen von Bauwerk were the people that pushed marginalism ahead. Is there much truth to that? Do they predate Alfred Marshall on this? Or?
They do, and they certainly develop. You could say they came to marginalism invented independently of one another, and a lot of times in history of economic thought, that's been attributed. That's what the marginal revolution's been attributed to. But if you look at like the spread of ideas and what made it mainstream in economics and created neoclassical economics as a distinct field, that was Alfred Marshall.
Okay. So I read a piece of yours at Palladium, and it's pinned on your Twitter feed. The marginalist revolution, is somehow a break with the labor theory of value. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm trying to think what one, because it almost feels like kind of a non sequitur. I feel like those things can be mutually exclusive somehow, but can you explain how they might not be?
Well, I mean, you can have a theory. I mean, I obviously accept the supply and demand curves of the Marshallian cross to in its limited sense. There's a stronger sense that's taught in like the higher econ classes about how general equilibrium works. It's absolute nonsense. But the basic idea of a specific market of a few firms or whatever is obviously correct. But the what it did structurally in economics was replace the idea of labor theory value, and this is explicit if you read Marshall's Principles of Economics, that he's using this as a way to attack Marx and the mostly Marx before Mill kind of used. Well, let's not get into Mill, but he used it to attack Marx and use it to replace the labor theory of value, not in the sense not to answer the same question that labor theory of value had, but to get rid of the question entirely.
Okay, so in my reading on this kind of literature years ago, it was when I was reading Marxist rebuttals to the Austrians, I got the impression that they felt like it was kind of an intentional undermining of the Marxist framework by interested like industrialist parties, who are sort of like glomming onto something that didn't actually have much merit, kind of value-free science merit as far as economic questions go. They were kind of reaching at it in order to undermine Marxism. It didn't really have much intellectual credibility. But I found it actually quite credible because, I think now I think it might come as kind of obvious to a lot of people that the labor theory of value can't possibly be correct because, to put it crudely, you spend 3 hours polishing a turd that no one is interested in buying, right? That has a lot to do with subjective value, and labor going into it would not have much to say about why that is worth anything.
So I think it's important. Well, I will say this first about some of the rebuttals and some of the critiques of ideology can be a bit vulgar in saying that, oh, this was all paid for by whatever big capitalists.
Yeah.
Usually it's more sophisticated than that. I tried to elaborate that in the article, that a lot of this is being driven by the state and whatever particular institutions and universities, and not just being paid for by investors or whatever. But I think that the labor theory of value is correct. It's correct on a different level of it's correct because it's answering a different question than what marginalism is. It's two different ideas of what value is, because the marginal theory of value, I mean, except when we're talking about general equilibrium, and I think it was Walras, or however you say his name, that was his project, which is kind of trying to do the same thing. But for the most part, marginalism can only really explain the prices in the short term. If you're trying to explain prices structurally and get the equilibrium on that level, that's what LTV is for. And we do have empirical data which suggests that it's correct. And the theory, the idea behind it is that no, like you don't create value by working. It's not like it's value emerge. It's an emergent phenomena out of production. So you're so we can use statistics of firms that are already being disciplined by the market that already have, like, if you were to like polish a turd for 3 hours or whatever, and there's no one wants to buy that, or if people did, like it's it's much more efficient. Everyone else does it at 1 hour or whatever, then you're going to be driven out of the market. And at any given point, you're going to have people doing it 3 hours or whatever, but because it's not profitable, people aren't going to do it very often. And that informs the average time that it takes to create a product.
Okay, so that feels to me like it's getting at the supply side of the issue. As far as the demand side, the demand for polished turds, where does that come in, and what implication does it have for labor time spent?
Right. So the idea is that that supply will move to meet demand. That whatever demand is, eventually supply will reach to meet it at whatever's profitable. Um, so if there is no demand, then you're not going to have an actual industry in a, like, your country, or you're not going to have an industry creating like mud pies or whatever if there's not a demand for it. And that's really on the level of abstraction that we're talking about.
Okay, so demand is the master and supply is the slave here ultimately. Is that not true? Which means
Well,
the theory of value um, would seem to be dependent on subjective value ultimately,
well,
which
if
maybe
you
is subjective with, as the term lets on. It's not subjective with a capital S. Like there may be certain universal constants as to what people actually want, and that may even tie somehow into labor, right?
well, I think that these theories are agnostic to demand. That you can have whatever level of demand you want, and like because supply will scale up to meet that. If we're talking about the like the demand will determine how big an industry is. It will determine like how much labor is spent in society going towards that thing, but it doesn't determine how much labor is spent per commodity on a good. That is determined by the technical relations of that particular industry.
Well, the more simple the economy, the easier it is for me to imagine labor theory or labor time spent having a lot to do with what is being demanded ultimately. So I think of like an artisan making custom boats or custom statues, right? Like it, because the time spent on that, I could see the more time spent on it, the greater its value in the eyes of the customer. That seems fairly straightforward. So I mean, if you can polish a canoe with all kinds of interesting etchings and engravings on the side, someone who spent 30 hours on it, I feel would command more in the market, would get more for it than someone who spent 10 hours. Now you could have someone who spent 10 hours who's highly talented, but that's what I mean by this. The more simple the market, the more I feel labor theory value has a lot of merit. Does the complexity of the market in any way undermine this in your eyes?
Well, I think that it's important to move beyond a particular price and start thinking about prices at like average prices, which is what the labor theory of value is concerned with. So let's say that deluxe canoes are a particular kind of commodity, and it certainly takes more time to produce them in general, and that's the idea. It's not that like it for a particular you can use marginalism to talk about particular prices, but that doesn't I feel like that's not very scientific. It kind of becomes just a truism, that this is worth whatever you feel it's worth. It's not actually telling us anything about how the economy as a whole is working.
Okay. I feel myself drifting toward this kind of very stripped down, almost Robinson Crusoe type economic theory, which a lot, the kind of individualist right has done this a lot, and um, they end up butting heads with leftists who are thinking sort of like society wide. And I mean, it's hard for me to pin down exactly where there would be kind of a methodological incongruity, but there must be some there. And yeah, Robinson Crusoe economics. That term actually reminds me of kind of a Rothbardian kind of framework and all of that. Um, but anyway, to get back to Marx. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, there's a funny connection there because Marx actually does bring up the Robinson Crusoe example in Capital, but he does it to a different in a different way. He goes he imagines Crusoe, like he creates his ledger that keeps track of all the different commodities that he has, or not commodities, but just goods that he creates and acquires. And he can imagine, like, well, I can spend this amount of time creating this, or like getting a fire started, or collecting coconuts or something, whatever. So whatever that sense, the all these goods are only worth to Robinson Crusoe the time he spends to get them. Now he can, like, there are certain things that he wants, and he's not going to spend time on things that he doesn't want. Um, he has to make that judgment for himself about um, like what he wants to spend time on, but he's going to keep track of it. Like, he's going to budget his day that way. Is the budget is in terms of his day, because it is not money, there's not anything else. The budget is in terms of what time he can spend on things.
Yeah. What was I if I recall in Das Kapital, I don't know which volume, but Marx spelled out the difference between simple and complex labor. Is it true that his notion of complex labor was just kind of a compound of simple labor, like, and so in that he felt that, you know, like a doctor's labor was objectively worth, say, you know, 40 times the labor of a simple factory worker or something like that. Is
Right.
that
So,
like an overreach on that whole labor theory of value kind of paradigm, or is there some way that all is quite sensible? And
well, it's a certain extent, like the ratio between skilled and unskilled labor in terms of its cost. Some of it's determined just by culture. You know, I mean, we just pay doctors more because that's what we're accustomed to. But if we were suddenly to have a bunch more people interested in becoming doctors, and it became a much more competitive profession, which I mean, like, if we removed um, a bunch of accreditation, or just got a lot of people to do it, then the difference between the ratio difference between what we pay for doctors and what we pay for ditch diggers is going to collapse down to whatever cost it takes to turn a regular person into a doctor in terms of training and what have you.
But is the idea that you know, that doctor's labor is an actual, like, can be represented mathematically as the difference between the labor of someone who just, you know, works in a toll booth, right? Is that in any way valid? Like, you know, it's 17 and a half times more skilled and you know, more valuable. Or is that only kind of a statistical artifact when you look at, like, Bureau of Labor statistics? Is there something more like deeper and more enduring than that? You know, that kind of mathematical difference.
It's not necessarily deeper into, like, because Marx makes a distinction between what the value of what workers produce versus what they get in wages or what have you. So it's not intrinsic to the type of work that they're doing. It's determined by the labor market.
Okay, so what is Marx's method for determining what their real value is that's independent of what the wages show?
So that's determined purely by the amount of uh, well, in the case of skilled labor versus simple unskilled labor, um, you still have to uh, include that cost in the value of the goods sent out.
Mm.
But beyond that, it, it's I mean the value is only determined by the amount of hours worked, um, and you can apply that like that ratio if you like. I'd have to look again about like if it means that the ratio is the same of um, creating more value, but there's there's a general principle there that if like you're a worker who can um, who's just more skilled, and because you're more skilled, you can produce a lot more goods than you as an individual. Like you're producing more value. Um, but that's still, I guess, kind of a statistical thing about whether like the if you're a certain class of worker that's just more intense because of like your techniques or whatever, and that's not generally like widespread, then you'll be adding more value.
Okay, so Marx recognized heterogeneity in the labor force. So not all doctors are equally skilled.
Right.
Uh, yeah, and I suppose at the other end there's less possibility of heterogeneity, right? Toll booth workers don't show as much variation.
I mean,
Um,
toll booths isn't a good example because you're not really producing a
Right.
commodity.
Yeah.
yes.
But I mean, if you're even in like a factory, you'll have some people who are more productive than others. I guess the question is,
Yeah.
I mean, more specific to professions is whether like I guess it still comes down to how like how competitive that profession is. Because if you proletarianize an industry, like it's happening now for a lot of different industries, and the costs go down, and you can have if you have a lot of people who can do this, then like the value add is going to go down.
Yeah. I'm thinking about kind of variation in skills at the lower end where there is not much possibility to display skill ranges from the what they call soft skills. Uh, just yeah, how what is your attitude like and that kind of thing? Are you generally upbeat? Do you make people around you feel comfortable and all that kind of stuff? Which actually leads me to the question: what does the left think about notions like soft skills, which seems to be sort of like a center-right sort of focus? Do they put much stock in like individual personality traits as mattering much in the grand scheme of things as far as remuneration?
I mean, you can have all kinds of random factors determining pay, and that kind of stuff. I guess the idea from our perspective is just that this is random noise that'll cancel out.
Okay, so the notion of post-scarcity economy, uh, the idea that physical stock is mattering less and less, the generation of material abundance is mattering less and less. Um, do you accept that, or do you feel like we're getting away from? I mean, I suppose it's kind of unquestionable that we're moving into a more kind of digital, ephemeral, sort of service-oriented economy where the collection of products, physically manifested to lay about in your house, to put in your driveway. The economy isn't as oriented around that as much, and things like that are part of what they call this transition to post-scarcity economy. Do you have any thoughts on that whole idea?
Yeah, I think that like the idea of post-industrial society, um, it it can often it's particularly been used in a very deceiving way, I feel, because like yes, we have become capable of producing the necessities for people's lives in such a great amount that we can afford to have people who aren't working on this, like
Yeah.
creating food and shelter and all those other things. Um, but I think that it becomes absurd to a certain extent that if we can do this, why do we why um, are we spending so much of our resource? Like we still have to um, feed and clothe the population, and the way to do that is to earn money through work. And uh, so you have people that are just that you have on the one hand a bunch of BS kind of jobs that get created, and you have people that are desperately trying to offer services, and creating a demand for this at the same time. I think that it would be more socially useful. Um, I mean, this is happening at the same time that, I mean, industrial production still hasn't gone away. It's just moved to East Asia for the most part. And we still have to think about industrial economics, I think, and that's something that often gets away from people who talk about this. We need to think about how we're producing these things in supply chains and logistics in order to ensure that, um, like, if you don't have these industries, if you just have a bunch of services, and you're relying on other people for those basic goods, industrial outputs, then you're vulnerable, and you're not just
Mm.
vulnerable to the other person saying we're not going to give it to you. You're vulnerable to supply chain shocks and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, that's
Um,
become salient in during this pandemic. People have talked about, yes, um, making sure that your supply chains are not in the hands, or crucial aspects of the supply chain are not in the hands of, rival major powers and all of that. I know that's become salient again with coronavirus. But even before that, there are reasons to be concerned about that, right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.